everybody, welcome back. It's a beautiful Monday. I mean, a little warmer than normal. I think we got one of those, what do they call Indian summers, where in early mid-October we get this real nice weather, and then it's going to change. It changes usually very quick, where we go from like warm to all of a sudden chilly cold. So we'll see how that works out. But anyway, I want to go ahead and start talking about one of my favorite chapters. That, of course, near and dear to my heart is radio. Since I did grow up loving radio and then got my dream job, did it for 3 years, did morning radio out in Terre Haute, Indiana, right after I finished graduate school. And I loved it. Being a big fish in a small pond was something great, except for the paychecks that came every 2 weeks. When you're in a small market, yeah, they may know you for 40 or 50 miles from where you are because of we had the 50,000 watts like any other New York City radio station. Except it was a very small market. So radio is just a great chapter. But before we get that, a couple of things. Number one, probably the biggest news mass media-wise is that James Bond opened up this past weekend in theaters, and I think it's in theaters only. Did $56 million here in the United States, which is not bad at all considering COVID. Now, when you come to the James Bond series, which of course this is the last one to be done by actor Daniel Craig, the James Bond series is iconic. Going all the way back to the first one in 1962 with the late great Sean Connery as James Bond, and then of course you've had all kinds of different actors including Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, and all of them right up to Daniel Craig. And they will do worldwide a James Bond film. If you look at, if you go to boxofficemojo.com, which I believe I did have on your course outline, it's a great website to see the box office receipts, how movies are doing, and that kind of thing. It's not uncommon that a James Bond flick will pull in between $800 million and over $1 billion worldwide. It's just very popular and has been for over 55 years. Only problem is with COVID, it's keeping a lot of theaters closed or a lot of people away from the theaters. So if we're to pull in $56 million during a time when we're still, in some places, locked down, or people won't go to the theater if they have to be masked and that kind of thing, I think that's pretty good. And it says something about not only the James Bond legacy, but also Daniel Craig on his way out, that he was a very popular James Bond and will always be counted as one of the best James Bonds, if not the best. So now, by the 1890s, communication had been very well established thanks to something called the telegraph. All right. Now, of course, with the telegraph, those are when you have poles, you have a wire on the poles, okay, and people would send Morse code. And of course, instead of having someone on the Pony Express, communication was much quicker. As a matter of fact, one of the places we saw this was with newspapers, is how news of Civil War battles would travel so quickly thanks to the telegraph. Is that, you used to have to relay it over several stations. The communication might only travel like 10 or 20 miles before someone would receive it, copy it down, and then they would have to transmit it in the opposite direction. But at least it would get there. If you found out about a Civil War battle 48 hours after it was over, back then that was considered huge. Of course, now we get instant updates on our smartphones as soon as as it's actually happening. But back then, if you got news of something 48 hours after it happened, that was usually very fast. And then, of course, come 1869, when Alexander Graham Bell said, "Watson, come in here, I need you," we established the telephone. So now, by the mid-1890s, communication is doing pretty well, except for one thing. And I sent you a picture, okay? That's New York Harbor, right around the turn of the century, going into the 1890s to 1900. Now, New York Harbor was a very busy place. Now, you may go there today on the Jersey side of the Hudson, and you'll see a couple of boats, maybe some, especially in the morning or in the late afternoon during rush hour, you'll see the ferries coming back and forth. But man, when ships, especially going into the 1890s, 1895 and stuff, when we had that massive immigration coming in from places like, of course, Columbus Day Italian heritage. There were a lot of Italians from southern Italy and Sicily between 1890 and 1920 that came on ship to America. Plus, of course, immigrants from all over the world. But that 1890 to 1920 time period was huge for immigration. That's when they came through on Ellis Island, and some great movies you've seen, the Ellis Island Experiment or Experience. So what you needed to do is what was missing is being able to communicate with ships. I mean, they could be out in the middle of the Hudson. You'd be able, thanks to underground or under the river cable, you could communicate from Manhattan to New Jersey in 1895 or 1898. But if there was a boat in the middle of the Hudson River, which was much closer, you couldn't communicate with them because there wasn't any wireless communication. Well, that's in the late 1890s, an Italian by the name of Guglielmo Marconi. He comes over and he introduces to us wireless radio. Basically what he did, and this was a great time for inventions and stuff, especially because you had that little guy down at exit 131 up the Parkway named Edison, okay? All the things that he was doing, and especially one of the things that he was doing very well was showing how to harness electronic energy, okay? That electricity, able to harness it and use it. So in this case, what he would do is you would have on land, by the way, please ignore my art, okay? I'm not a Hunter Biden. Anyway, he would harness a box, okay? He would then use that electronic energy to send up into the air some Morse code. Now, when you sent that using electronic energy, when you sent the Morse code into the air, it would then be carried by the natural sound waves of the earth. Okay? Now, what this is called is when you send something, it's almost like when you say, echo, 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 echo. What's carrying your voice when you do that? It's amplitude modulation, the natural waves of the earth. We have these natural sound waves. They're there. They're always there. Okay? So you can send a signal up there, and what would happen is you would have a ship, and it would have an antenna with a receiver, and they would receive that signal wirelessly. So what Marconi did is he came to America and introduced wireless radio. Well, it was pretty much a novelty, and some boats were using it, not a whole lot, even by 1906. When a young man comes up with the idea of actually using your voice, all right, talking into, instead of using the Morse code, is actually talking into that box that harnesses the energy, sends that signal up. The only problem is sometimes they forgot to tell the people on the ship. So the people on the ship might be waiting for Morse code. All of a sudden, they hear the voice, "Hi, are you there?" They think it's a ghost in the receiver. That actually did happen back in 1906 because they didn't know that there was actually going to be some kind of sound or voice that was going to be able to do it. Luckily, later on, they were able to harness it. But the funny thing is that as the beginnings of wireless radio are happening, nobody's even taking it too seriously. As a matter of fact, by 1912, it was such a novelty that there was someone who worked for the American Marconi Company who was receiving and sending wireless messages back and forth to ships, and they were sitting in a department store window in New York City. So people would come by and say, "Oh, look, Muffy, there's that boy doing that radio thing, that wireless radio, talking to the ships. Come on, let's go get dinner at Delmonico's." You know, that's what they were doing in 1912, walking back and forth up on Park Avenue in New York City. So this guy is sitting in this department store window, and that's what he's doing. It's a novelty. Well, that all changed, that novelty, in April of 1912. Now, anybody want to take a guess what happened in April of 1912 that might have changed this? I'll give you a hint. If you were watching MTV this past weekend, I think the movie was on like 2 or 3 times. I'm talking about the sinking of the Titanic. All right? Remember Leo DiCaprio, right? And here's what happened is that as the Titanic hits the iceberg and realizes it's going to go down, it starts to send out that Morse code signal. Now, at this point, there was a brand new international maritime code to send out that meant distress. And it doesn't mean saved our ship. It was just SOS, because for you to pick it up, like if you're not even really paying attention, you hear code, no big deal. All of a sudden you hear, and that's SOS. And that, of course, signaled this is a distress signal. There is trouble. So, of course, the Titanic starts sending out the distress signal. Well, as it's being passed on from one station in Nova Scotia down to New York City, okay, because it's in the North Atlantic, this 21-year-old kid sitting in that department store window working for the American Marconi Company, he starts now copying this code and starts transmitting back. Well, now people are now starting to find out from his little window here that the Titanic is in trouble, that the Titanic is sinking. Now remember, this was the maiden voyage of the Titanic, made a lot of newspapers that it was going to happen, a lot of very prominent people with the last name of Getty and Carnegie, John Jacob Astor, they were on this ship. And they were coming over on this maiden voyage because it was the Titanic, the unsinkable ship. Well, guess what? The unsinkable ship is sinking. And they were getting like real-time news as it was happening, thanks to this wireless radio. Now, that young kid stayed in that department store window for over 50 straight hours. And his name was David Sarnoff. So now we see the importance, the real importance of wireless radio. But unfortunately, and fortunately, and I'll tell you why. I say unfortunately because in August of 1914, I think it was August, in 1914 we have the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which then of course began put everything in together to start World War I. So now Europe, of course, is going to war. We're staying out, but then we ended up getting in early 1917, and we pretty much finished it off. But I say, unfortunately, I mean, it's unfortunate that we ever have a war. But during the 20th century, World War I, World War II, they really helped to fast forward a lot of technological advances. And one of those was the idea that we could really use wireless radio on land also. See, before Titanic and before World War I, yeah, wireless radio, that's good for the shore, good for ships, but I've got all these poles here, I've got all these wires here, the telephone lines and everything else. Well, guess what? You're on the battlefield, and there's a great movie, an old movie with Kirk Douglas, where you see a good idea of this, where the front line is talking by phone to where the artillery is, or where the headquarters are, about a mile or two behind the enemy lines. And they need to talk to one another, but if a bomb comes in between and blows up somewhere in between them and breaks up the line, the cable, well then they can't talk to one another. If they had wireless, then they would be able to do that. As a matter of fact, some of you may have seen probably the greatest World War II movie of all time. And I do, there's a lot of like fiction in films, and I do understand that, but sometimes they're pretty historically accurate. Saving Private Ryan, probably the greatest World War II film ever made. And you see in the beginning, and this is 1944, and yet there's Tom Hanks as they land on Omaha Beach, and he's trying to talk back to the ship, and he's using a wireless radio. Okay? There's no wire between him and the ships, and he's talking back to the ships. It's almost like one of the first ever cell phones. So you see this technology in war. So as World War I is continuing, you realize that not just for sea, talking to ships, but over land, wireless radio could be very, very convenient and could be very advantageous for you to have. Well, finally, November 1918, World War I ends, thanks to a lot of Marines, yes, who fought over there. Of course, in U.S. doughboys, the U.S. Army helped to really bring that war to an end. And then, of course, comes 1919. Now the war is over. Now it's time to settle back in. Well, one person in particular has decided, I'm going to take radio and I'm going to make it into entertainment. I'm going to make it to where a radio receiver It's not just to, communicate like messages back and forth to people who are communicating on ships or anything. No, you can have a radio receiver in your home and have it as entertainment. You can listen to we could broadcast into that box, and that box will bring you radio, news, music, and then later on, sports. So in 1919, we see the formation of the first ever radio company. It's a company that's going to be responsible for making radio receivers and selling them. And it was called the Radio Corporation of America, better known as RCA. And RCA, for about $9, I think it was going to sell you receivers that you could have in your house, and you can now listen and be entertained. And the president and CEO of RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, was none other than David Sarnoff. So now that kid who in 1912 was sitting in that department store window during Titanic over 50 hours, by 1919 he is now the president of the Radio Corporation of America. He's now going to sell you these radio receivers that you can have at home. Well, wireless radio picks up very quickly. Stations now start to pop up all over the place that we're able to broadcast. And then, of course, receivers are going crazy. The funny thing is, though, is once you bought a receiver, if it was good enough, it was going to last you for a while. And that's the way, because Sarnoff also had a radio station. The problem was, and I think he had WEAF in New York City, you were paying for everything. You were paying for the talent. You were paying for this. That's not the way you're going to make money in radio, by the sale of the radio receivers. Because if Sony buys a receiver in 1921 and it lasts them 10 years, guess what? We made the sale, that's it. We're not making any more money off it. So it was early on, in 1922, on WEAF in New York City, that we get the first radio commercial. And believe it or not, it is still patterned off of Benjamin Day. Benjamin Day's idea is still in works here. Here's what you did. You went to someone and you said, listen, you give me money. I will then, on my airwaves, to all the people who are listening, I will then talk about your product, or let you talk about your product. How does it work? Just like Benjamin Day. You give me money, I provide you, what's the D word? What's the D word? Distribution. Alright? So, in 1922, some guy gets on the air on WAF, and for 20 minutes, he paid his money. For 20 minutes, he talks about this new apartment complex he had just opened up and finished building out in a far-off place called Queens. And of course, it didn't take long before all those apartments were full, thanks to radio advertising. And of course, even today, newspapers, television, radio, and even the internet, websites, a lot of them still have that interlocking relationship with advertising. That's how they thrive, that's how they live. You give me money, I provide you distribution. So now radio stations are big, they're small. The only problem is that each radio station, number one, if you've ever tried to broadcast on a radio station, one thing you need to know is that if you have a radio station and you're broadcasting, let's say at 50,000 watts, like a lot of New York City radio stations, like I had over at Mix FM in Terre Haute, you're going to have to pay the electric bill. And trust me when I tell you, the electric bill is monstrous. That's a lot of electronic energy for you to burst out up into the airwaves, 50,000 watts. So what was happening was you had radio stations popping up and then going out of business, because if there's one thing you had to do was you had to pay the electric bill, but then you also had to provide talent. And that's going to be expensive. Yeah, some people would do it for free. Hey, I just want to get on the radio, man. I'll do it for free. So they would sing or do a play or do a show, whatever it was. And remember, in the early days of radio, I mean, there's all kinds of different type of broadcasting. There's news, there's soap operas, there's westerns, all kinds of things that we'll talk more about on Thursday. But how am I going to pay for all this? This is crazy. Well, one guy comes up with an idea. Uh-oh, I just dropped my eraser. Hold on, I'm still here, you don't see? No, I'm back. One guy comes up with an idea. He says, this is what we'll do. We'll build what we call a network. All right? And here's what's going to happen. Now, I have the flagship station in New York City. What I'll do is I'll provide the talent. I will then send you my signal to stations all over the country, whether wirelessly or through wire, okay? So then you could broadcast out from your city. I'll provide the talent, you use my talent, and then when you sell advertising to promote that show, we'll split it 50-50. So what radio stations said all across the country was, okay, this sounds good, because this guy in New York City, his flagship station is going to get the top talent. I don't have to pay talent now. And I just have to sell advertising, like the Arthur Godfrey show or the Glenn Miller show or the Duke Ellington show. All right, I can promote that to my city or my station in St. Louis or in Iowa or in Portland, Oregon. I can say, tune in tonight to my station. I'll have the Duke Ellington show. If you want to buy advertising, it's going to cost you $10 for a 30-second commercial because it is Duke Ellington. And then when I sell that $10 ad, I keep $5. I give the other $5 to that flagship station. And what that flagship station would have set up, if you were now taking my signal, taking my talent that I'm providing for you, we would now be called a network. And you would be, since you're picking up my signal with the talent I'm providing, you would be an affiliate of my network. And in 1926, we see the first ever broadcast network, a radio network, called the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. So now the NBC radio network is established, and the president and CEO of the NBC radio network is none other than David Sarnoff. As a broadcast professional, this is my idol. I mean, Sarnoff started it all. From sitting in that department store window with the Titanic in 1912 to then creating the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, to build these receivers in 1919 to now in 1926. He is now the CEO and president of the first ever radio network. So, WEAF now becomes WNBC Radio in New York City. He would then have the talent come into the studios in New York City. They would broadcast. It could be news, sports, whatever. You would then, through wireless or wire, you would then grab his show and broadcast it from your transmitter, whether you were in Iowa, Nebraska, Chicago, Bangor, Maine, Miami, Florida. Your station would now be an affiliate of the NBC radio network, or an NBC affiliate. And of course, if you sold a radio ad during the Duke Ellington show for $10, you keep $5, the other $5 goes to David Sarnoff. And then radio really took off, especially because now you had radio networks starting to form. We're going to stop right there, but what I want you to do for me is, as we're going to continue talking about this on Thursday, we're going to talk more about the current state of radio. I want you to give me a 4 to 5 sentence paragraph. Get it to me by Wednesday at 8 p.m. And I want you to tell me why you don't or why you do listen to what we call terrestrial radio. What that means is whatever on your AM dial or your FM dial. I know a lot of people don't even listen to radio anymore. They go with their streaming service, Amazon Music, Pandora, whatever it is that you go with. So give me an idea. Or I'll tell you what. If you want to go in the opposite, if you want to give me a 4 to 5 sentence paragraph why you do listen to terrestrial radio, AM dial, FM dial, give me that. And I'll need those paragraphs by Wednesday, 8 p.m. And on Thursday, we're going to finish up the radio chapter. All right, you guys, have a good one, and we'll see you then.